recently Putin was talking about the nuclear weapons, the reduction of nuclear weapons. He used the word in Russian. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. It's "хим," like something like this, which means horseradish. I published this on my YouTube channel, and there was a big discussion about everybody was saying something so differently. Oh, but you wrote a very good article on consortium news, and you describe all of what does it mean and why Putin felt that way. Could you describe us about this word and what does it mean in Russian and why did Putin use this word?
Well, first of all, Vladimir Putin is somebody who has a very good sense of humor, and he's also very much a man of the people. You you don't serve in the capacity he served as in the KGB without learning a few slang words, colloquialisms, some more salty than others. So let's just say that he's an expert of the working man's use of the Russian language. And one of the terms that is used, it's derived from a longer phrase where chrenim is used, give them horseradishes. But it's a slang. Chrin is similar in construct and sound to another word that describes the male genitalia. And so in short, this phrase means F you, screw you. It's a throwaway state. It's a term that implies a total disregard for the other person's point of view. Chrenim, no, we're just to horseradishes with you. He used it to emphasize the Russian response to Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of the Biden administration, a presentation that he gave to the Arms Control Association earlier this month, which is derived from a stance being articulated by the United States. Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said, look, we're in constant discussion with the Americans about this issue, but our positions are irreconcilable. They want something, we want another. We don't care anymore about what they want. And that's the important thing about this. This wasn't diplomacy that said, we're taking into account our American counterparts' points of view, and we're carefully considering it, we'll come back with a response. It's, you don't matter anymore. Nothing you say matters. Nothing you do matters. You don't matter. And how did the Russians get to this point? Because the United States has been negotiating in bad faith. The United States has been using disarmament mechanisms not as a vehicle of achieving equitable disarmament, thereby securing both nations in mutual fashion, but to achieve a unilateral advantage. We have lied to the Russians. We have cheated the Russians. And then we continue to do so today, seeking to gain access to Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent at a time when we claim that our strategic objective is the strategic defeat of Russia. Now, if you're the Russians and the United States says our goal is your strategic defeat, why would you allow the United States access to and control, therefore, of your strategic nuclear deterrent? You wouldn't. And so the Russians have said it's impossible to discuss disarmament or arms control with the United States, with the Biden administration at this point in time, because it's fruitless. It achieves nothing. Until the United States changes its policy objective vis-a-vis Russia, and frankly speaking, its overall attitude toward Russia, Russia gains nothing from being involved in this. So chrenim, pound sand, F you. And they mean it.
How does this counteroffensive is working for Ukraine? It doesn't seem to have any gain for Ukraine. And it seems like a trap for them. How do you evaluate this defensive system of the Russian in this battle?
Well, first of all, the Russians are playing to their doctrinal strength. From the time of the Soviet Army, uh, Russia's overall posture has been to assume the defense, absorb an enemy's attack, and then counterattack. That's how they've approached the military art for some time now. And so, what we have right now in along the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine is the Russian military laying out a doctrinally sound fortified defense, triple layers, three belts, defensive belts, protected by minefields, obstacles, fire support, artillery, aircraft, helicopters. The guy who, this is not just old defensive doctrine. The gentleman who designed this is Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk. He has experience in the first part of this conflict. He was the deputy commander, I believe, of the 58th Combined Arms Army. And he was dispatched to the Combined Arms Academy, Russia's major military academy. And he was tasked with rethinking Russia's defensive doctrine based upon the lessons learned of the about technology and modern warfare. And he redid Russian defensive doctrine, reimagined it. And the defenses that are being built right now, that have been built, that the Russians have fallen in on, are a byproduct of this reimagination. And then to make matters worse for the Ukrainians, the Russians pulled him out of the academy and put him in charge of the defense of the critical area, the Zaporizhia area. So the man who has invented Russian defense doctrine, perfected it, is now in charge of it. The Russian troops that are there are, again, employed in a doctrinal fashion. That means to the density necessary to defend the lines. They are well trained, well led, well equipped. They have fantastic morale. And the end result is that the Russian defenses represent the most heavily fortified, professionally staffed defense belt in modern history. Against this, the NATO has sought to train a Ukrainian military force of some 60,000 strong, equip them with Western technology, and use them to implement the most complicated, demanding, dangerous military mission imaginable. That is the breaching assault of a fortified position. And again, I've told you that the Russian fortified position is the most heavily fortified position in modern history, commanded by the man who designed it. So this means that the Ukrainians are going to have to, assemble a military capability that is up to the task of defeating the Russians. And simply put, it didn't happen. And NATO knew this. This is the crime. The crime is that NATO knew that it was setting the Ukrainians up for failure. Why? Because NATO doctrine, in order to breach a defensive position of this nature, requires that you clear the airspace of enemy aircraft, that no helicopters can fly, that the enemy isn't able to bomb, that you suppress Russian artillery fires, for instance, that you disrupt Russian command and control, that all of this takes place as part of a campaign of suppression that is designed to protect your assault force as they work their way through the minefields and the obstacle belts to breach the lines. The Ukrainians have no air force, and everybody knows this. So why would you send a force forward knowing that you can't suppress Russian air power? Ukraine has no air defense force. Everybody knows this. So Russian helicopters are going to fly in the forward area uninterrupted. Why would you attempt an attack when the Russian helicopters are there? Ukraine has an artillery disadvantage and is unable to suppress Russian artillery. So why would you send your forces into harm's way knowing that the Russians are going to hit you with artillery fire? And Ukraine has no effective electronic warfare capability. So you can't disrupt Russian communications and command and control. So why would you send forces forward? And the answer is because NATO lied to Ukraine. NATO said that the Russian forces would run away, would break on contact, were very brittle, wouldn't hold. All the Ukrainians had to do is test them a little bit and they would retreat, and then the Ukrainians could advance forward. But everybody knew this was a lie. There's not a military professional out there that doesn't understand that the Russians are a very competent military, well-trained, well-led, well-equipped, well-motivated. So to hope that the Russians would run away, that's not a military option. General Petraeus, retired general, is on national TV saying, we had hoped the Russians would run away. That's not how you fight wars, General. You know that. You don't hope. You need to know to the most highest certainty possible what the enemy is going to do. That's what intelligence officers do. That's what I used to do, is try to inform my boss to the highest degree of certainty possible what the enemy is capable of doing. This is an intelligence failure, but it's one that was done deliberately. So it's a policy failure. Or we have to even look at it more cynically. We knew we were sending the Ukrainians to die. We knew the Ukrainians couldn't pierce the lines, but we allowed them to go forward anyways. Why? Because our policy is to bring harm to Russia. Right now, Vladimir Putin has spoken of a 10-to-1 casualty ratio. Russian estimates now are that 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died so far in this offensive. 13,000. That means that 1,300 Russians have died. And that's all we care about. You see, all we want to do is kill Russians. Lindsey Graham has bragged about this, that this is the best investment America's ever made because it results in dead Russians. Lindsey Graham has also spoken of being willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. You see, we don't care about the Ukrainians. Their lives don't matter. We can lose them all as long as we bring the Russians pain. That's our policy, to bring pain to Russia. But the Russians are capable of absorbing this pain. I mean, just look at what today is. It's the National Day of Sorrow and Remembrance in Russia, and indeed in many of the former Soviet republics. This is the day that Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union back June 22nd, 1941, beginning a conflict that stretched on for nearly 4 years that cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives. 27 million lives. The Russians know about sacrifice. They know what it takes to defend their homeland. And so far, they've indicated they are willing to do what it takes to defend themselves against the threat posed by Ukraine and the collective West. And I think today is the perfect time to point out that the Russians can absorb far more pain than the West can dole out. And that when all is said is done, it's going to be the West that quits, the West that retreats from the battlefield, not the Russians.
When you go on offensive, you have to have a something like 3-to-1 advantage on the enemy, yeah. But they didn't have this type of advantage, and they didn't have the training they needed to have before doing this counteroffensive. They received training in 35 countries. How ridiculous is this? How they can put these puzzles together? These soldiers were trained in different countries. How they can work together?
Well, it goes beyond that. Again, let's just go back to point out a couple just basic foundational facts. The Russian defenses are the most fortified, heavily defended network in modern history. To breach defenses such as this is the most difficult military mission possible. You need training, you need equipment, and you need, as you pointed out, sufficient military strength, manpower. The Ukrainians have assembled 60,000 troops. That's sufficient if they concentrate them all in a given area and they support them with the required fire support and other supporting operations. They may be able to penetrate the Russian defensive lines. Maybe. But there's a couple things that have to exist. One, the Ukrainians need to be intimately familiar with the equipment that they're operating. That means that they not only have to have the basic training to turn it on, turn left, right, etc., but they have to be almost one with their equipment. You need an operator that has a sixth sense about how the engine is running, whether or not you can get the acceleration, what the performance characteristics are if you make a hard left turn and then seek to pivot your gun left. Know your crew so that when you give an order, you know it's going to be taken, because in combat, every second counts, every second matters. If you miscalculate by one moment, you're dead, you're going to die. That's the reality of combat. So to survive in combat, the people operating the equipment need to be one with it. This means that you have to have more than a couple weeks familiarization training. You have had to live with this piece of equipment, sleep with it, eat with it, know every aspect of it for months, if not years. It needs to be your lover, so to speak. The Ukrainians don't know this equipment. It's still a stranger to them. They barely know how to turn it on. They definitely don't know how to operate it under the harsh conditions of combat. Two, you have to be able to take this equipment and operate it in an overall structure of what they call combined arms warfare. A tank by itself is nothing. An armored infantry fighting vehicle by itself is nothing. Together, if employed as a team, cooperating, you can, using combined arms tactics and operational theory, suppress the enemy, maneuver forward, achieve your objective. It takes highly trained personnel years to develop this skill set. We've taken Ukrainians who have the most basic training. We've put them in with equipment they don't know. And then we've asked them to execute a mission they cannot execute. The Ukrainians are incapable of doing sophisticated combined arms operations simply because they don't have the training to do this. But what we've done is cheated the system. You see, we brought them in, we've trained them, and we told them you have sufficient training. Then we put them in a training area in Germany, and we war gamed a scenario that has them attacking the Russians, but we predicated by saying the Russians will run away the moment you show up, the Russians will run away. And we've said because of that, all the other advantages Russia has doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Russia has air power, artillery, etc. Because back in September, when the Ukrainians attacked in Kharkov and they penetrated the Russian defensive lines, the Russians withdrew. Russians had the air power, but they weren't able to bring it, in a manner to stop the attack. And so a lot of assumptions were made about Russia's capability, willingness to fight, that allowed the Ukrainians to believe that even though they lacked the training and lacked the experience, that they could succeed. The problem is the Russians weren't going to run away. The Russians were highly trained. They were operating a defensive doctrine that is sound. The Ukrainians weren't even able to reach the initial defensive line. They died leading up to it. They've taken eight villages, but all those villages were in the forward areas, factored into the Russian concept of flexible defense. They haven't reached the first Russian defensive line, let alone breach it. And remember, that line is designed to be breached. The first line is meant to be breached. It's designed to channelize the attack, focus the enemy's resources, and then breaching that, trap them in a cauldron of fire that will then allow the Russians to destroy them. And when they reach the second line, then the third line releases the counterattacking force, which envelops them and destroys them. That's the doctrine. That's the way it's supposed to work. But the Ukrainians can't even get to the first line, let alone breach it. This attack was doomed the moment it began. It never should have been implemented. The 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers that died have been murdered by their NATO allies in the United States. We knew they were going to die. But all we care about is that for those 13,000, there's 1,300 dead Russians. That's all we care about.
What Biden gonna do about this? Because this is a suicidal attack. What is the end game of this policy?
Well, the end game was supposed to be that the Ukrainians would sacrifice themselves in an effort to bring so much pain to Russia that Russia would quit, that Russia would back down. Again, we don't care about Ukraine. I hope that's obvious to everybody listening. We don't care about Ukraine. We don't care about their lives. We don't care about their future. We care nothing about Ukraine. We're using Ukraine as a vehicle to inflict pain on Russia. Lindsey Graham has said he's willing to let Ukrainians fight to the last man. Ann Applebaum, a noted anti-Putin writer, has written an article where she basically alludes to George Soros's 1993 article, which says that the ideal situation for NATO is to have a nation that provides Eastern European manpower that could be married up with NATO technology to bring harm to Russia. Well, that's what happened in Ukraine. Ukraine is Eastern European manpower. They will never be a NATO nation. They were never intended to be a NATO nation. We lured them in with a false hope, a false promise, so that they would sacrifice their manpower. We would assist them by providing technology, but the idea is that the body bags that return from the front line aren't NATO body bags. They're Eastern European body bags, Ukrainian body bags. And that's the reality of what's happening today. Ukraine has allowed itself to be used for a larger objective of NATO. And remember, NATO's job at this point in time isn't to win, because they can't win. Their job is to create relevance. After the August 2021 defeat of the United States and NATO in Afghanistan, many in NATO began to question the role of NATO. Does it need to exist? What are we doing? Is America a reliable partner? Because America ran away, abandoned them. And so what's going on in Ukraine is designed to be a challenge that will compel NATO to rebuild its military, to revitalize itself with a new mission, and that new mission is confronting Russia. Unfortunately for NATO, Russia just happens to be better at everything than NATO is, and NATO is going to lose, is losing, and has no chance of victory.
Recently, Putin showed some documents that showed Ukrainians really were close to get an agreement with Russia. But yet Ukrainians are denying those documents that Putin showed to the African leaders. This leadership in Ukraine is in favor of whom? Their people are dying. They're killing their young Ukrainians. Why they're doing this? Why is he doing this?
I mean, only Zelensky can ultimately answer that question. But we know that even before Zelensky, there was Petro Poroshenko, and Poroshenko was the man who, together with Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, lied about the Minsk Accords. Had the Ukrainians simply signed the Minsk Agreement, there wouldn't have been a war. Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk would be part of Ukraine today. They lost those territories because the Ukrainians wouldn't implement Minsk. All they had to do is sign the peace treaty that Putin was willing to go with. A lot of people don't realize that there were negotiations between Ukraine and Russia up until the point when Russia intervened. But the Ukrainians mocked the Russians, saying that the Russians believed them when they were negotiating, but it wasn't. They were just trying to set the Russians up until Ukraine could invade. But the trick was on them because Russia preempted that with their own special military operation. But the purpose of the special military operation was not the defeat of Ukraine, but to bring Ukraine back to the negotiating table to complete the negotiations Russia had entered into before the war. And they almost had a deal. On 1 April in Istanbul, they were supposed to sit down and finalize a document that the Ukrainian negotiators had signed off on and said, yes, this is acceptable. The Russians believed the Ukrainians, and they unilaterally withdrew their troops from around Kiev, around Kharkov, and other areas as a sign of good faith, as a confidence building measure. And what did the Ukrainians do? They claimed that they defeated the Russians, that this is proof that the Russians have been defeated, and then they tore up the agreement and continued the conflict under instructions of NATO. Had Ukraine signed that document on 1 April, again, the territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia would be Ukraine today. 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be alive today. Tens of millions of displaced Ukrainians would have their homes today. $1 trillion of infrastructure damage would not have been done. Donetsk and Lugansk would be independent, but there would be a referendum where if Ukraine believes that they could provide a better governing alternative than the Russians, the people could have voted to stay in Ukraine. There would have been security guarantees. Even though Ukraine would not have been a NATO member, Russia was willing to have security guarantees from nations such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and others to tell the Ukrainians that, Russia won't, if Russia invades, there would be a consequence. Russia bent over backwards to create the opportunity for peace. And today, Ukraine would gladly sign something like that, but they could have signed it in 1 April. It's too late today. and the reason why they do this is that Ukraine believes the West when the West says, we want you to be a member of the European Union, we want you to be a member of NATO. I'll just give you the harsh reality. Ukraine will never be a member of the European Union. Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. What will happen to Ukraine is that it will be destroyed as a modern nation, that its decision to continue this fight will more than likely cost it an additional 30% of its territory as Russia occupies Odessa, Kharkov, Nikolaev, and other territories and destroys the Zelensky government. This is a tragedy for the nation of Ukraine, but they only have themselves to blame.
There is an article in Financial Times that says that Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland gonna have some meetings with Global South, with Brazil, India, with even China to talk about this war in Ukraine. What do they want to do with these leaders, with these countries?
Well, it appears what they want to do is convince these countries to oppose Russia's actions in Ukraine, to put pressure on Russia to get Russia to agree to a negotiated settlement. They don't understand that the world's changed, that the world isn't, while many of these nations may not support what Russia's doing in Ukraine, they recognize that the real threat to the world isn't Russia, but the United States, that it's America's continued effort to promulgate a rules-based international order that will, in perpetuity, make the non-American states puppet states of the United States. That's what we want. We want Brazil to do what we want. You need to obey us. We need to be able to control you. And so this is what we hope to achieve, to pressure these nations into opposing Russia and supporting American foreign policy. It's a fool's errand, because I think the world has woken up to what the reality of America is, and they will simply say that there's no benefit to them for doing what the Americans want. America is creating a global situation because of our arrogance, a global situation where we are becoming increasingly irrelevant. We just don't matter anymore.
Today, Biden confused the U.S. anthem with the Indian one. Beside Modi, if it was Donald Trump, he was all over mainstream media. How this double standard work in the United States, considering this precedents?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, what we're seeing play out before us is a human tragedy. I don't like Joe Biden. I think everybody knows that. I have a deep hatred for the man. Having said that, though, this is a man who is well into dementia. His memory is shot. He's forgetful. And this is sad. Because this shouldn't happen to somebody of his age and his capacity. He should be led off to a retirement home and be allowed to drool into a cup and be spoon-fed ice cream, because that's all he's capable of doing nowadays. And this is not just an embarrassment for him and the nation. This is a national security issue. This is a man who is supposed to be in command of the armed forces of the United States, inclusive of the world's second largest nuclear arsenal, and he is showing advanced stages of losing his mental faculties. He is forgetful. He doesn't know where he is, and we can't have that, especially at a time when there's a world crisis where nuclear weapons are on the table. People are discussing them. We need a president that is fully in control. And we don't have that right now. This is a very, very dangerous situation.
Yesterday, I was talking with Larry Johnson. He was talking about if it was possible to have a third party, having Donald Trump and RFK Jr. in this party, it's going to be successful. How do you find it?
The wild card there isn't RFK Jr. The wild card is Donald Trump. He has a very expansive support, base of support. he joked a while ago that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and fire a bullet down the street and kill somebody, and they would let him walk free. He has this sense of entitlement, but he's also got a target around his back, and the Democrats are doing everything they can to bring him down. And to think that there wouldn't be negative consequences of this persecution is wrong. I believe there will be negative consequences. Whether it's sufficient to nullify him as a presidential candidate, we shall see. RFK Jr. Is running as a Democrat, not as an independent. And he believes that he can beat Joe Biden. And I believe he can beat Joe Biden. I think especially as Joe Biden continues to deteriorate, he is a walking, talking embarrassment. He is, he brings nothing positive to the scene anymore. And his collapse, so too is the collapse of the credibility of the establishment of the Democratic Party that put him in power. Because look what they've done. Then not only do we have Joe Biden losing his mental ability before our very eyes, his vice president, Kamala Harris, is the singular worst vice president in the history of the United States. She is just an embarrassment. I mean, there's nothing positive about her. She should never have been nominated for the job, and she was nominated despite the fact that she has no popular support. There's a reason why she dropped out of the Democratic National, the race for the nomination of the Democratic Party, because nobody likes her. She was picked because she's a black woman. That's it. They picked her so the black woman could attract the female vote and the minority vote. And we're left with this singularly incompetent person who I think the only reason why Joe Biden continues to be allowed to totter through is that Joe Biden on his worst day is better than Kamala Harris on her best day. So that's the future of the Democratic Party right there. Either Joe Biden or I believe Kamala Harris will step in and claim the right to run for office. RFK Jr. can beat them. Will beat them. And he believes so. So he's not going to align himself with Donald Trump. He's going to try to beat Joe Biden in the primary and then run against Donald Trump or anybody else the Republican Party puts up. And here's the thing. RFK Jr. could beat them. RFK Jr., if he wins the Democratic primary, is very capable of beating anybody. Yeah, Donald Trump, we'd have to see. I mean, because Donald Trump is just a special case. You never count him out. But there's no one else in the Republican Party that's running that can beat RFK Jr. if RFK Jr. wins the Democratic primary. All these other people are peripheral players. They don't have national level constituencies of any meaningful fashion. RFK Jr. has captured the imagination of a lot of people, and he's only getting stronger. He just gave one heck of a speech the other day, yesterday, I believe. And, people are tired of the establishment. They're tired of perpetual war. And remember, Donald Trump, whatever you think about him, he had 4 years to do something, and he didn't. And so now we have RFK Jr., who is articulating policies of peace, of compassion, and I think you're going to find that a lot of people will gravitate towards him and be willing to give him a chance instead of giving Donald Trump a second chance. So I think RFK Jr. is somebody who can't be counted out, especially at this stage of the race. He's getting stronger every day.
How do you see the relation between China and the United States? What's going on? Blinken went to China. He said he was trying to solve some issues on Taiwan. But when he came back, Joe Biden suddenly called Xi as a dictator. What is the game here?
Well, the game is that America doesn't have a viable China policy. What makes our aggressive stance on Taiwan work is the relationship between the United States and the current president of Taiwan. She and her party have taken a fairly aggressive stance on the potential of independence, of making Taiwan separate from China. But she is up for re-election in November of 2024, same time that Joe Biden is. But she has no chance. She's going to be defeated, and her party is going to be defeated by the Kuomintang party, in large part because the people of Taiwan aren't itching for a confrontation. They don't want a war. The Kuomintang party has already begun outreach to the Chinese Communist Party about discussions about how to bring the Taiwan and China closer together. It's not an outright saying we want to join China, but it's saying we want to cooperate with China, which pushes them in the direction of some sort of a settlement between Taiwan and China that is independent of American pressure. The Biden administration, I think, has come to the realization of two things. One, that they have to be careful about going down a policy path that makes them irrelevant if the Kuomintang party wins in November of 2024. Because if the United States puts its full weight behind the current government in Taiwan and uses that government and our support of that government as a means of trying to contain and weaken China, and then the Kuomintang wins, we've isolated ourselves. We made ourselves irrelevant. We're no longer part of the solution. We've defined ourselves as the problem. And so what we need to do is, and what Blinken is trying to do, is get the United States to a position of policy neutral, meaning that politically they're going to have to articulate some of the things that they've always articulated, such as if China attacks Taiwan, we will come to Taiwan's defense. But we've had to come out and articulate that we don't believe Taiwan should be independent, and we believe in the peaceful resolution of the differences. So that's what Blinken was trying to do. And then, of course, Joe Biden, the dementia-addled person that he is, went off and said something that's insulting to President Xi Jinping, and exposed the fact that the United States can't be trusted. We can't be trusted to keep our word about anything. And that's a sad state of affairs, but that's where we're at.
It seems that China going to have a military base in Cuba.
I think what they're negotiating is a Chinese presence in a intelligence gathering facility in Cuba. That's different than from having a military presence, and it replicates similar relationships that we, the United States, enjoy with nations on the periphery of China. We spend a lot of time and effort collecting intelligence on China by flying aircraft and sailing ships close to the Chinese, national borders. And so I think what we're seeing here is China getting some payback, helping develop an intelligence base in Cuba that, will give China an advantageous perch to gather more intelligence. It's quid pro quo. China's not putting an invasion force in Cuba. It's simply, I believe, discussions at this point in time about Chinese cooperation in developing this intelligence collection site.